Well, this one was a long time coming. This is the full movie of building the aCuMai Kopis and dagger. I've done bits and pieces of it that I've posted as parts, but this is the full shot. Watch for the links to the more in-depth videos, and I'll post all of them below in the description. And help me out by liking the video, and if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe and get notified when I post the next one. Okay, let's jump right in. Weld it up, give it a quick oil bath, and let's throw it in the forge. As it comes up to temperature, I'm going to start fluxing it. I just use borax. It's cheap, you can buy it at the grocery store, and it's easy to find. So we'll draw out a couple billets, get them all nice and flat. We're going to then grind off the scale, cut and restack them so that we have about 240 layers on each side. I love this divider that I picked up. I used to always screw up when trying to measure and come up with the cuts that make nice even pieces. This takes all the guesswork out of it. Use the 2x72 to clean off all the scale. We'll weld them back up, give them a quick oil bath, throw them back into the forge, and time to start drawing out the final billets we're going to use for each side of the aCuMai. When I make the aCuMai, I'm going to put a 1/4 inch piece of 1084 in the middle of it, but it's going to be 2.5 inches wide instead of 2. This is really to compensate for my poor welding. So we're going to use some copper, layer it between the two Damascus billets we just made, and weld it all up. We'll layer up one of the layers of Damascus, 2 layers of the 4mm copper, the layer of 1084, 2 copper, and then the Damascus. So I find it easier to weld the 90-degree fillet than just a solid bead. So I weld all the way around the billet to stop any of the copper from melting out between the Damascus and the 1084. And now to draw it out. I'll actually use the drawing dies to create valleys and hills in the copper itself, giving it a little bit of a unique texture so that when we grind it, we get that nice wavy pattern. I also angle the blade a little bit as it's going through the press. That'll give it a little bit of a nice curve because the Kopis itself has a curve, and we have to do stock removal on this. To get the width, I used a couple of railroad ties and created some spreading dies. I need to get width both in the belly and up near the base of the handle. So I'm using an old railway tie as a spreading die. Once I've got the basic shape down, we actually have to resort to stock removal. You can't forge aCuMai because it'll separate between the copper and the steel. I'm going to take it over to the 2x72 and grind off just a bit, just to make sure we've got good adhesion between the copper and the steel, and it looks pretty good. After that, we'll actually mark out exactly where the blade is and start cutting off as much as we can before we actually start burning up grinder belts. I use a water jet system on my 2x72 now. Really helps keep things cool and stop from getting too hot, especially on aCuMai. With the basic shape ground out, I'm going to then throw on some dicam and then start laying out the grind lines for the bevels. I'll use the height gauge to mark a center line, and it turned out really good. We've got the 1084 on the center all the way through the blade. So we'll go back to the 2x72. We'll start grinding in this bevels, taking off a lot, and then we're going to start seeing the copper peek through. And that's kind of always the exciting part to me when I'm doing these. And it looks like it's bonded quite nicely. Now we need to shape up the handle. We're going to start off by drilling some holes through. We'll end up using the bandsaw to cut out some of the metal. And then it's just a matter of back to the 2x72, grinding out what we can. And with that, we actually end up with a blade that looks like it's ready to heat treat. So, on to making Medusa's head. I started off by making a clay mock-up of what I was looking for, just to get the size and proportion correct. It's a nice day, so time to go sit on the deck. I'm using an elk antler that matched the size of my clay mock-up. We'll trace out some guidelines and then we'll go at it with the Dremel, and it's just a matter of carving away a whole bunch of antler. This took me just about a day, and one of the nice things is there was a little bit of a breeze. If you do this, make sure you wear a mask. It stinks and you get dust everywhere. The breeze really helped to blow a lot of that away. But in the end, we ended up with an antler head that looked okay. Later on, we're actually going to cover it with epoxy and seal it. But for right now, it's ready to mount. And now that we finished building the kiln, it's time to actually heat treat this. If you want to see how I built the kiln, check out the link below. But we go through a couple normalization cycles and then we quench it. Once the blade's cooled off, I've hand sanded it to about 400 to grit. Time to put my touch mark on. I'm using the electro etching machine I made. We'll position it with the handle, use some water with some salt in it, and then we'll start off first by using the DC current to go deep and then the AC current to darken it. And finally, on to my favorite part. This is where we actually get to etch the steel, find out what our Damascus looks like. The etchant I'm going to use is kind of my own mix. I'll put a link below as to how I make it, but it's a combination of ferrochloric acid and muriatic acid and distilled water. I'm going to do 3-minute sessions, etching, light sanding, back in the etching, just to get that nice shine on all of the steel. I made some scales using some black micarta, some fake ivory with copper spacers. Word of warning, fake ivory may look nice, guys, but man, is it tough to work with. It gets dirty by looking at it. I used just a dab of black dye in the epoxy, just so that if any epoxy does fill a void or anything else, it'll be the same color as my liners. With the scales on, we'll actually start using some acetone to start wiping off any of the excess epoxy, and then we'll start to clamp it up. I don't think you can ever have too many clamps, but I'm continually clamping, wiping the epoxy off, clamping, wiping the epoxy off. Eventually we get it all fit up and it's time to let the epoxy dry. With everything dried up, I'll take it over to the bandsaw where I'm going to just trim off the pins close. I don't want to mark the handle scales, so I'm proud by still a 1/16 of an inch. For hand sanding, what I do is I always back my sandpaper with packing tape. It's cheap, but it actually adds a lot of strength to the sandpaper so that it doesn't tear when it gets wet and you're just hand sanding. And now we're going to add Medusa's head to the handle, but first we have to bleach the antler so that it's all white. It's still got some markings and everything in it. So what I'm using is some hydrogen peroxide. I actually let it sit in the hydrogen peroxide 6, maybe 7 hours, and then rinsed it all off. Next, we're actually going to put a white coat of epoxy around the antler just to seal all the holes. So I'll mix up a bit of epoxy and literally paint it on. And finally, the last step, simply to epoxy the head onto the pin. We clean up all of the epoxy, again with a little bit of acetone, and nice blade. Let's make the scabbard. We'll start off with a couple pieces of ash, and I'll trace out the blade. I'll mark it to make sure that we can actually draw and sheath the sword. There's actually a lot of setup to this. So now I actually have to mark out where the bevels are on the sheath so I get a nice tight fit all the way down. And to do that, I actually draw a grid all over the board, and then simply transfer the measurements of the bevel ridge onto the ash wood. In order to transfer the curve at the front of the handle, I'm simply going to use masking tape. Carefully cut it right against the seam, and then I've got an outline of that curve that I can transfer to the wood. With everything marked up, now it's time to make sawdust. I'm using an angle grinder and a cutting disc to score the lines of the bevel ridge and the outside of the sheath. I'm only going 1/8 of an inch in, but just so I've got some hard lines to sand up against. I use a flap disc, and then starting from the bevel ridge, I'll start just removing material. We'll do a test fit up, and now to cut that curve in at the front of the sheath as well, I'll use the masking tape trick. Here I was dumb. I originally started off without covering up the handle, and then I got dust all over that fake ivory, and I didn't show it on camera, but I was cursing as I was cleaning off all that fake ivory again. Then it's just test fitting, taking a little bit out, test fitting, taking a little bit out until we get a good solid fit. Now we need to start on the second side. To do the second side, the first thing we have to do is actually mark out and trace lines that we can glue against, where we can actually transfer the measurements of that inner cavity onto the second half. So I'll cut out the shape and then transfer all of the measurements, that distance, to the second half. Notice I didn't trace out the blade shape again because I don't know if I would have had it at the same angle or the right angle. So what I do is draw out a grid and copy it over again, and then I end up with exactly the same shape on both halves. After repeating the grinding process on the second half, we're just going to do a test fit. And now we're actually starting to get a sheath that we can draw and sheath into the wood. With everything fitting up nice, I'm now going to transfer the measurements of the cavity on the inside to the outside of the scabbard, so I accidentally don't sand or cut too close to that inside cavity. I'm going to glue the two halves together using some epoxy. So we'll coat it up, clamp it together, and then we're getting ready to shape it, which is just more sanding. This is actually where I wished I would have had more clamps. For final shaping, I'll take it over to the bandsaw, take off a bulk of the wood, and then head over to the 2x72. I needed to knock off a lot of the thickness, so I went back to the bandsaw. That was just a lot of wood to sand off. Once I start getting close, I start actually using the slack belt portion a lot to get nice rounds on everything. We're going to add the copper bands using some 80 mil copper, and I'm simply just cutting strips, forming it to shape. To make the copper tip, I use the tape trick again. So I coat everything with masking tape, cut it off, and that actually gives me the outline template for the copper that I can then form around the tip. To get the nice color, what I did is I actually burnt the surface of the ash wood and then used some boiled linseed oil. I did have a bit of a disaster here, but if you want to see that, go check out the full build video of the scabbard, and you'll see why epoxy might not have been the best idea when burning the wood. I really love how the copper stands out against that burnt wood. Next, we are going to use some antique brass rivets to hold the copper on, and then we'll add some leather straps. For the straps, I actually use a snakeskin stamp I found to stamp snakeskin into the straps, and then we're going to airbrush them and put a nice dark border around the straps to give them that little bit of an aged look. Rivet them on to the scabbard, and I'm pretty pleased. This turned out to be a really nice project. If you like this, please like and subscribe.